So, welcome to our RPA for Dummies event. We are live on LinkedIn and YouTube. And just so there is no mistaking who is going to be the dummy as a part of this, it's very clear. So, wanted you to be aware of that. And we're live from the Parker and Lynch Consulting Studios. We do have 72 offices nationwide for all your consulting and finance and accounting staffing needs. So, please feel free to reach out to me. And I am very honored to welcome in our guest, Kevin Casey. There's Kevin. Can you hear me okay?
I can. How are you?
I'm great. This is a perfect connection. Hold on one second here. I'm going to add a little bit of fun to this. There we go. So now when people pop up, they know exactly what we're talking about. We got a little robot there. I did not give him a name, but I think if you come onto this webcast, you're going to know who the dummy is right away. And the funny story is that my wife does screen printing shirts, and this is one that I asked her to do, and I've never seen her make a shirt so fast in my life. I'm wondering if it was somewhere in the house ready for me to wear. So anyway, so I'm very excited to have you. I appreciate you joining. Kevin is a lecturing fellow at Duke University, also writes for the Enterprisers Project, which is a CIO and IT type publication online at the enterprisersproject.com, correct?
Yep, enterprisersproject.com. That's right.
Awesome. And Kevin's written several articles about RPA, and he and I started talking about it. And it's a hot topic out there. And there's some people like me and others that we hear it, but we don't necessarily know what it is. And so I thought it would be good to get us together and answer some of those questions from a high level perspective for people that have heard about it or interested in it. And I thought that would be helpful for them. So with that said, I think the most important question and the first question is, are the machines taking over?
Well, yes, I'm sorry to start on a disappointing note if we had high hopes for actual robots. But yeah, I think the first article I wrote for the Enterprisers Project on this topic, which kind of began my own crash course in learning about RPA, was I quoted a source who clarified that at the get-go that unfortunately there are no actual robots involved. So the graphic, you won't actually see anything like that in your RPA journey, I don't think.
So Sarah Connor was wrong, and we're fine, and Arnold Schwarzenegger is safe in his home in LA, and we're good.
At least with RPA, maybe in other AI disciplines that's still possible, but it probably won't be RPA's fault as I understand it.
All right, good deal. Well, go ahead and answer the question. What is RPA? What is robotic process automation for somebody that literally has never heard of it before?
Sure. So, I've found it to be possibly a misleading name because of that reason. When I hear robot or robotics, I think of either Arnold Schwarzenegger or, in business context, things like the robotic arm on an assembly line or something like that. But it's really just a type of software that can automate, as the name suggests, certain kinds of computer-based processes in various organizations. So it typically would take a rules-based process as something that can be defined with an if-then statement that would now or in the past would have required a person like you or I to do manually on a laptop or a desktop, and can automate that process using software and take some of that kind of manual repetitive effort off of a human employee's plate.
Okay. And I think it's fair to ask fairly early, because I know this gets tossed around a little bit. Do you only see this as a way for companies to do things automatically and then lay off a bunch of people? Are people going to lose their jobs because of RPA?
I think that's a great question. It's a big deal right now, because automation across a variety of contexts is a big topic. It depends on who you ask. The ideal outcome here for organizations would be to take a lot of that kind of manual, repetitive, boring, in a lot of cases, work off of a person's plate and then be able to kind of redirect them into more creative, intellectually demanding work. And so in that scenario, someone's job might actually be improved. But of course, that's going to depend on that organization. So when you talk to like RPA software vendors, that's how they pitch it. This helps you use your human talent, your human creativity in the way it was best intended, and that it won't cause job loss. I think that really does depend on an organization implementing it that way, and having the kind of executive leadership and buy-in, and that we're going to use this to kind of elevate the people that we have, and not just use this as a way to get rid of people.
That makes sense. Who, and I think I know the answer just because of who you write for, but who is the people that are heading up these types of projects at corporations? Because, I happen to be on the finance and accounting side of things, but I see a lot of it from IT, CIO perspective, but it's not just a finance thing. It can be across all areas. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, so I think this will be an interesting thing to follow. As as you noted at the start, the interest in this topic is kind of white hot. I keep writing about it because there seems to be an insatiable appetite for the topic. But I think where like the leadership or the management oversight of an RPA project lies is also going to vary by organization. So it might start in some companies in the finance department with a controller or a CFO. In others, it might be an IT project, the CIO, CTO, or someone in the IT leadership team. I think if you look at some of the RPA software vendors, and there are quite a few of them now, they seem to be trying to make their platforms, their tools, as usable as possible for people who aren't actually technical, so that you could deploy a software bot. You could implement RPA without necessarily needing a big software engineering project internally. So I think that could vary. When I've talked to subject matter experts myself in this area, I think most people see it as you're best served having it be cross-functional. If you only start it, it could start anywhere, but if you keep it siloed, an example someone gave me recently was if you're using it with your ERP system, and so maybe your finance or accounting folks are doing that on their own, but then IT makes a change to that ERP system, that might break your bot, that might break your process. And if they're not, those two departments aren't talking or aren't even aware that one or the other is using automation in this way, you could run into problems in that fashion. So I think probably in larger organizations, especially, it's best looked at as a cross-functional program.
Got it. That makes sense. And I was actually meeting with somebody this morning, and he knew we were doing this show, and I mentioned it to him, and he was talking about logistics and supply chain and customer service. And I was really taken aback by how many different processes, and he had come from a company that had 60 different bots. And that surprised me. Is that something that you're used to as you talk to people?
I think that you can scale to like almost limitless levels depending on the kinds of processes you have. I think it makes sense to imagine that the larger an organization you have, probably the more possibilities you have to implement RPA. One best practice that you do hear a lot across different kinds of technologies, but I think makes a lot of sense with RPA that someone shared with me recently in one of my articles was you really want to try, if you're starting from scratch, you want to start small. Don't try to go from 0 to 60 bots,
Yep.
in your first phase of this. Start with a small process that is highly repetitive and can show the value of it. But I think it's sort of, you hear from folks who talk about, and especially in larger enterprises, they will build even like a center of excellence approach where you could really scale this to have like this, you'll hear the phrase digital workforce, where you have these software bots kind of almost invisibly working alongside your actual people.
And you mentioned sort of the softwares and the different vendors that are out there, but you also mentioned it's not necessarily something that you have to do. So even to, install two bots, in finance to do, billing or reconciliations or something that can be repetitive, is it something from a coding perspective that a reasonably trained person would be able to do?
I think so. This is a little bit where, as a writer and not an actual, I'm not a software engineer myself.
Yep.
I haven't. I'm basing this on my conversations and my own research. I think what the conventional wisdom I've gleaned is that it's the barrier to entry to get started is relatively low. It's the scale if you want to grow to that kind of bot army size and really build this out and have it actually be successful in a measurable way. That's where the heavier effort is involved. But a lot of the RPA platforms that are out there, they have a sort of vested interest in trying to make it as easy as possible to get started, so that you could have, say, a business analyst do this. You don't need someone. You don't need to pull someone off your software development team to build this out yourself. So I think the barrier to getting started is actually fairly low compared to some other technologies. And so the heavier effort is going to be in growing it, if you intend to grow it and kind of have it be something that really scales in your company.
Got it. So if I'm a CFO, CIO, CEO, and I'm watching this show right now, and I think, hey, this is something that we need to start looking into, and I think you wrote an article about this. What is the first step to RPA? What's the first thing that we need to do?
I did write about this earlier this month, actually. I think one of the things that you really have to do, and that requires really no technical know-how, is to figure out, identify which processes make sense. So again, these are usually like your manual, your repetitive computer-based processes that require currently a lot of manual effort. People typically recommend like high volume. Someone recently said to me, don't start with your super brittle, long process that only runs once or twice a month, because it's going to be a pain and you're not going to really see the value. You want to look for those really repetitive, high volume computer-based tasks that are rules-based. So it's really, I think that's the process, identifying those processes. One of the things people have repeatedly said to me is RPA projects typically fail when an organization or anyone in that organization tries to use RPA to automate a process that they don't actually understand very well, or that is broken in some other way, because RPA is not actually going to fix the flaws in your process. You need to do that before you automate it. So it's really, step one is identifying that process or processes and making sure that you really understand them. I think from there, it's a matter of involving the right stakeholders. You have to fairly early on really document that process, because you're going to have to sort of train the robot, train the bot, even if you're using one of these software platforms to help. But it's really about starting with the process and making sure it's well defined and it's a good fit and that you understand it inside and out. And I've been told that by a couple of people that they're surprised at how often people don't actually do that. They just try to, let's automate this thing, and then they realize they don't understand what that's.
Let's automate a bad process and see what happens.
Which is
So
usually
it's almost like process documentation, but a little bit of process improvement after that to figure out, are we doing this the right way first before we automate it? Is that fair?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, this, in a sense, there's an aspect of this that's not that new. It's sort of just another evolution of the, longstanding, business process automation field. But I think one of the things that people keep reminding me of when I write these stories is that the process optimization needs to take place before you try to run that process with a bot.
Yeah. I just lost my question. Where did it go? So as you're doing the process documentation and you are looking at the processes, you're fixing them, and then you decide that, hey, this is probably one that we should be setting up in automation. We talked earlier about maybe doing a trial run and seeing how that's going to work. Like, is there a recommended time that we should have this run to know that this is working?
It's a good question.
I'm throwing hardballs at you now.
Yeah, I'm not sure. And I haven't asked that question myself yet, so I don't know if I have the answer ready. So you're asking, is there a good way to measure how effective it is in terms of a testing period?
When are we comfortable that, hey, this is working and
Got it.
we're good to go, and maybe let's move on to the next one?
So I think the way I would answer that is, once you get through those first few steps, the other thing that various people in this field have really been hammering on with me is you have to identify for yourself how you're going to measure whether this is working or not. So some examples in a recent article are around what are if there's a financial profile or impact, what are the operational metrics? Is this reducing a person's, freeing up 30% of their time to go work on a different project now, those kinds of, so I think you could define it however you want. It's back to that question of why are you doing this? Not doing it for the sake of it, but doing it because you're trying to achieve a particular goal and how you're going to measure that. Yeah. I think from a testing standpoint, it could be phased, and the first phase would really be, once you run this bot, is it actually working? Because if you've missed something in your process, it's going to kind of run into a virtual wall. It's not like some AI or cognitive disciplines where it's going to be able to kind of teach itself or retrain itself. It's going to need a human being to do that. So I think once you feel comfortable that it's actually running the way you anticipated it running is a good milestone. And then I think it is probably especially if you're encountering any kind of cultural resistance, being able to show some quantifiable or qualitative results from your first few implementations is how you're going to get people on board to do a bigger scale project or program and be able to really expand.
I remembered my question, and you've said a couple things that reminded me of it. And you and I talked about this earlier when we were just chatting earlier before the show. We see some of these things, at least in my opinion, as macros, and some companies that are like developing macros that have now turned into RPA type companies. What is the difference here?
So my understanding of the difference would be, I kind of think of it like RPA is like the evolved descendant of the macros that, like, I remember from even when I was much, much younger and starting to use a computer. So I think RPA can be thought of as being able to handle more sophisticated processes than a macro. I think usually the definition of a macro is that it's going to handle one single task.
Got it.
Whereas RPA could, if it's the right kind of process, computer-based process, handle a series of tasks in a process that could in fact include a macro. An if-then step could be, if this, then run that macro. So I think it's sort of just like a more sophisticated evolution of what I think of when I hear the word macro. I think of like the macro in an Excel spreadsheet or something like that.
Yep. And you mentioned AI earlier. And I know there's BPM and some of these other terms out there. What is the difference? What's the difference between RPA and AI?
I wrote about this as well, and what I found was not everyone agrees on that. Okay. It somewhat depends on whose definitions you're using, particularly of AI. The Enterprisers Project did a report not too long ago tailored to executives about AI and noted that by the definition that report used, RPA would qualify. But some people would say pure RPA, which is not thought of as a cognitive technology per se, isn't AI. I think you can kind of like get bogged down in those semantics, and that's fine. But I think the difference is when you think of like machine learning as a discipline of AI, is those algorithms by design are being fed data with which they can then learn and actually start to make their own decisions. Whereas an RPA bot on its own has to be taught, instructed to take the next step in a process. It's not going to figure that out on its own.
That's a great explanation. Did I tell you I was going to ask that?
I don't think
I'm
going to say no. I want to make myself.
Yes, that was money. That makes total sense to me. Can you imagine sitting at a bar next to people that are arguing about whether or not RPA is AI? Like, that would be amazing. I think I would sit there and listen to that and just keep pounding beers, because that's pretty epic.
That's probably better than most, more intellectual than most bar arguments.
Yeah, probably. So we've got our processes. We know that they're up to par. We've set up a bot. I think I saw on Enterpriser's project an article that somebody else had written about what happens when bots break down. And so it's not just something that you set it up and poof, you're good forever. It is something like, would you have to have a team there that is managing bots? Like, how would that work?
Yeah, so that's one of the where some of the I think automation anxiety is real and something that organizations have to really think about and invest in. But that's one example where RPA is not just some straightforward story of cutting the human out of the loop, because they do require oversight. Some of the folks I've talked to they encourage thinking of it as a digital workforce or a digital worker that needs a manager, that needs ongoing management. So they do break. Really, anytime a process changes, you would probably need to revisit any bot that's interacting with that process. A common example would be if you have if you've used RPA to automate the movement of data from one system to another, and that involves like entering data in a field on a web form, for example, or copy pasting from one field to the other. If that field moves, if your UI team or a designer moves that field for some reason, the bot would likely break. You'd have to retrain it too. So it's not a set it and forget it thing. It does require some means for ongoing oversight and management. And I think in companies that are really going to do a wide scale project, the center of excellence approach is one that people keep mentioning to me. There's an article written by the CIO of Adobe on Enterpriser's project about their center of excellence approach. So I've heard that one come up quite a bit, but I think in general, it's another sort of recipe for failure is when you assume I'm just going to turn this thing on and then I never have to think about it again. It's probably going to need some ongoing tweaking and revisiting.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like a human.
Yeah.
Things happen, right?
Yeah.
Is there a specific industry or a specific type of company that is this prime for this? I've heard financial services talked about a little bit. Are you hearing certain industries, this is what they have to do?
I think, the finance field in general, which obviously spans finance departments within companies, which spans multiple industries, obviously, is commonly one that comes up. But I think
like banking.
Yeah, I think any industry that has repetitive, manually intensive, computer-based tasks is probably has candidates for RPA.
Okay.
It's not going to be something you use for like if part of a process includes standing up from your desk and going to a file cabinet and pulling something from that filing cabinet. That's where again there's no action.
A real robot, yeah.
Then you need a real robot for that. But any function or industry that has that probably has something that might be a candidate. So I recently reported an article that hasn't come out yet. I don't think probably will soon. Just on looking at some use cases outside of finance, so areas like HR, IT itself, with things like new user provisioning. A common place to look that I've been told is anytime you have data moving or information moving from one system to another in your organization, one application to another, one database, and those systems aren't integrated via APIs or some other kind of backend integration, that's probably a possible place to look, because that probably means today a human has to sit there and copy paste all that stuff from this place to the next place.
Being in the industry that I'm in, I can tell you that happens a lot.
Yeah, it's very,
Companies
very
with, like,
common.
15 disparate systems that don't talk to each other, and I think that creates a lot of manual work. Can the bot act as an API to get one to the other?
I get, I guess that's an interesting way of describing it. I had not thought of that before. I don't think people would say it's the same thing.
Yeah.
But it's doing similar work. It's a different way of kind of integrating two systems, and not offloading that repetitive effort on a person, because it's often like kind of copy paste type effort.
Yeah.
That, again, people are human intelligence is probably better served elsewhere than all that kind of copy paste. So I think you could think of it that way. They're not one and the same, but it's another way of bridging systems, or steps in a process.
Okay. And then are there other, I know we talked earlier about, HR, supply chain. Are there areas that maybe somebody wouldn't think of that you think would be a good place for RPA that we're not thinking of outside of what you just mentioned?
I think that the one that, to be honest, when I was connecting with people for this story that's in the queue now, is I have to confess, I hadn't thought about IT itself as being a place but you do, when you think about it, in most enterprise IT departments, you still have a lot of that, new user on your help desk or some other function like that, a lot of manual effort to, say, set up a new user, onboard a new user in all those 15 disparate systems that you're talking about. So that is one I hadn't thought about. I think where sort of the imagination can run a bit is, as you pointed out, it's 2020, and if you listen to certain software sales pitches, they'll tell you everything is, integrated and cloud native and all that, use all the buzzwords. The reality for most businesses, in my experience, is that you do have those 15 disparate systems that are actually surprisingly manual, and they're not going anywhere anytime soon for most companies. So if you think in terms of where are those spots where we can't actually automatically move information from one of those systems to the other today, it could be that RPA might be applicable there if that process is largely rules-based and computer-based.
Okay. I don't know if it was one of your stories or something else that I had read, but do you feel like what's the next phase of RPA? Like, is AI going to take over RPA? Like, what are you and I going to be talking about in 10 years? I guess that's a better question outside of Duke basketball.
It's not a new phrase or new term, but I keep seeing from the RPA vendors the term intelligent automation in the RPA context, which, generally speaking, I think is referring to what I think you'll see. The trend that will happen, and is already probably happening, is RPA deployed in concert with more cognitive technologies like machine learning or other kind of versions of cognitive automation, so that it becomes kind of extensible, so that for some companies, for example, RPA might actually be the beginning of a longer journey with more intelligent forms of automation. So I think that's going to be probably one of the big trends, is a company that has some success with RPA today will then use that as sort of a springboard or a foundation for adding more cognitive types of automation on top of that. And then where they have systems that are like self-learning or can start to make decisions almost like it is a human making that decision.
Well, and also I think there's probably some predictive analysis in there and behavior that the intelligence is going to use going forward as well. So
right,
ought to be interesting. More robots telling us what we're going to do, predicting it before we actually do it.
Yep.
So what So we talked about the who, we talked about the why, um, we talked about the where, like which companies. Um, do you feel like companies wouldn't have to necessarily reach out to any of these vendors? Like this is something they can start to do on their own, and then perhaps bring in somebody, or somebody on their team could know how to develop one just to try it out. And I don't know if you have relationships with these vendors, please don't say, hey, don't call these people. I'm not telling you that, but
No, I don't. I don't. And actually, I'm avoiding naming them because I don't want to appear like I'm endorsing someone or something, because I'm not.
I'm waiting for you to hold up a Coke or something and be like, look at those names.
No. I think, again, that's probably organization. If you have good IT resources and development folks, you can probably get started with this on your own for sure. Because again, it's at the end of the day, it's just software, and
Yep.
there are no actual robots involved, so you don't need those. So that it's going to depend. So maybe in a smaller organization, or just any company where your development resources are really tied up in other projects. Part of the appeal of some of those vendors is that you could have someone who's not in a technical role, in a finance department or in HR, um, go out and at least begin to test this stuff without needing someone from the IT team to help them. So it probably depends, but yeah, I think you could certainly get started with this on your own if you have the right people in place without going out and asking for a vendor's help per se.
Got it. Or bringing in a high cost consultant from one of those vendors.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I know you've written several articles about this. What have we missed that I'm not asking you? Is there anything specific that you wanted to talk about that you think is important to mention for people?
We've covered a lot of the things that I thought would come up. I think that I probably have already mentioned some of these, but yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to identifying the right processes, so that are rules based. You can kind of define them in if then statements. If this, do that.
Yep.
The mantra that I keep hearing is one of the quick ways to fail with this would be to implement it with a broken process, or a process you simply realize later we didn't realize how many different points this process touches, or how many steps there are. So that's really, I think, is the table stakes, is identifying where this is going to work for you. And then I think the other one is that goes hand in hand with that, that I glossed over, but has been a consistent topic that other people have brought up with me, is the need to have something in place to measure whether this is successful. And those metrics could be very dependent on your industry, your business, why you're using this. But if you don't have that in place, you're kind of just launching your bot army and having no way to tell if it would be sort of like having an employee with no performance objectives or a way of understanding if they're being successful in their work. And so that's something that people have consistently been reminding me to recommend you actually think about before you start, not 6 months after you've been doing this.
Are you seeing people doing like a cost benefit analysis after putting in there, like, we save 30% of time on a 60K employee, and so this is the money we've spent? Are you seeing people doing that, or have you talked to anybody about that?
I think that is definitely one of the approaches people take with this. Like one of the key measurement buckets would be what is the financial impact, and if you're using this to relieve some of that labor intensive and not so pretty low skilled effort on the part of a person, yeah, what does that translate to in terms of time saved or cost saved? Or where have they been able to make an impact elsewhere as a result of not having to be copy pasting from PDF invoices into a finance database to get people paid? So that would certainly be, I think, a common way people would start to think about this.
Are you hearing about any? You mentioned ERP, so you've got your, SAPs and those types of companies out there. Are you hearing them putting RPA into their systems?
That is not something I've really dug into yet. It wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't also surprise me if some of those big names are using this internally themselves. But I have not actually dug into that topic, so I'll have to add it to my list.
All right, come back to me on that one with an article.
I will.
All right. So last question: how is Duke going to do in the tournament this year? Are you a big basketball fan? I mean, it's like the basketball mecca over there.
I am, and this is being recorded, right? So I need to be careful here. You know, I don't
Last
think I'm
night was
ready.
rough. Let's just put it out there.
I don't think I'm ready to fill out my bracket yet because it seems like a wide open year. I grew up in Big East country though, so even though about a third of the original Big East teams are now in the ACC, my heart is still in the Big East. So I'm not. That's not one question I can answer with much education at the moment. But yeah, I saw that it didn't go well for them last night, but
yeah.
Their track record is pretty good. So
yeah, they're young. They're young. It's all right. Well, I appreciate your time. This has been great. I hope that there's been some things that people have taken away from this. I really loved your RPA versus AI question. Like that was something that stuck with me. So I appreciate you taking the time. I know this is something you didn't have to do, and we started talking back in like October about this. So
yeah.
I'm glad we were able to get it done, and I really appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for having me on. Glad to do it, and we'll hopefully talk with you again.
All right, thanks, brother. See ya.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you everybody that joined. Let me get rid of this thing here. If you have any questions about this, I can definitely put you in touch with Kevin. Obviously, he is a writer about this, and there are certainly people that have been doing this out there, but I know he's very knowledgeable about the topic. So I appreciate you taking the time to be here and sitting with this dummy, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.